Great, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name's Connor. I organize the CWE Root Cause Mapping Working Group, and I'm also the CWE Top 25 lead. So I have a lot of experience with root cause mapping. We'll be talking today about effectively mapping CVEs to their root cause CWEs. And joining me with this presentation is also Steve, if you want to introduce yourself as well, Steve.
Hi, everyone. CWE Technical Lead, co-founder of CVE way back in 1999. Glad to see everyone.
All right. So we have a short agenda. I'll kind of breeze through it. We're going to be talking about, why you should map to CWE, and then some tips and tricks to avoid some pitfalls, and then a short discussion on AI at the end. So get us started. Why map to CWE? I think first we wanted to start by acknowledging some real world limitations that there could be in mapping. So often, we realize that there can be limited time or maybe even limited expertise to do effective mapping. That's something that we realize. There could be conflicting goals in analyzing vulnerabilities and also, writing how to write CVE descriptions. We realize as the CWE team that the actual weakness of root cause, it's not the core component of CVE descriptions, but it is an important part of overall what a CVE record is. We realize there might be situations where CNAs don't necessarily want to provide the most accurate root cause details, for differing reasons. I know there are some reasons where people don't want to provide as much info to give attackers the way to attack. We think it's really important to put root cause into the CVE descriptions. That's just something from our perspective. We realize that there might be researchers that are trying to arrive at a root cause, but it might be difficult because they don't have all of the information that the actual developer might have. And then in other cases, there might be the instance of information overload where there's just a lot of details in a bug report and it's hard. Maybe you're looking at a commit history, and it might be hard to really narrow down exactly where that root cause is coming in from. Another limitation we've seen is this reliance on the CWE View 1003, where this is a view where in CWE this is a subset of weaknesses that have been identified for the ease of mapping. And this is something that came about, I don't know, I want to say maybe 10 or so years ago. That was meant to be a good starting point for NVD analysts to kind of go through and have a subset of CWEs that they could use for mapping, and make the whole CWE scope a lot less intimidating and challenging. And while this view was good back then, it's not necessarily been updated to the point that we wish it had been. There's been new CWEs added that are good candidates for root cause mapping, but might not be included in this view. So relying too much on this view can really limit the accuracy of mappings and really getting at the very specific root cause. And from the CWE perspective, we believe that the CNAs themselves, and honestly the developers, are best positions to perform these accurate and precise mappings, because they have the information, as the most information coming from the source. As a CWE team, we've done a lot of mappings after the fact, looking at CVE descriptions from a third-party perspective. And while we are very confident in being able to perform root cause mapping, you run into limitations with however much information is in the description and what references are provided, and sometimes that's just not quite enough information to be able to go back and assign a true root cause. We understand the root cause analysis it's difficult. It's a difficult skill to learn, and we've realized throughout the years it's also a difficult skill to teach. But hopefully, with some of the tips in the later slides, we'll be able to kind of eliminate some of those pitfalls and arrive at better mappings overall. So just from our perspective, these are some of the benefits that we see mapping to CWE. Obviously, very interested to hear in the chat as well. If there's anything we didn't list here that you think is a good benefit, or maybe reasons why you think you shouldn't be mapping to CWE, we'd be interested to hear that perspective as well. But the first one I wanted to kind of bring up was this concept of consumer trust. So being able to accurately map to root cause CWEs provides that trust in your consumers that you're able to understand what the vulnerabilities are doing, and understanding how to actually mitigate those at the very root cause, and not just mitigating the symptoms. So being able to get really far left and understanding where these vulnerabilities are coming from, and then being able to eliminate those entirely. There's also a concept of community weakness trend analysis. So having accurate CWE root cause mappings in CVE records enables all kinds of trend analysis in the community, just looking at CVE as a whole. And one of those, that we publish is the CWE Top 25. So what we do is we look at root cause mappings throughout all CVEs and try to look at trends of weaknesses and list which weaknesses appear to be happening more often and are also very severe. And that helps us determine our top 25 list, and it helps inform industry. And then the last one that we think of is the internal weakness trend analysis. So having those accurate CWE mappings can help you, as the developers, understand where the mistakes are happening, and try to figure out, what mistakes are happening most commonly and how can we eliminate those completely during development, and really understanding the trends that maybe you as a company are making weakness-wise. So getting into kind of the tips and tricks for mapping, one really important aspect to mapping is really understanding the language that we use to talk about vulnerabilities versus talking about the root cause weaknesses that enable those vulnerabilities to happen. So, we've kind of broken this up into the two factors, right? There's a weakness mindset where you're getting your mind ready to talk about the weakness and the root cause, but there's also the vulnerability mindset that I know a lot of you are familiar with, talking about things like impact and the actual attack that's happening, and maybe even the mitigations that are needed to prevent that attack from happening. So I think a lot of vulnerability thinking is focused on the results and what's happening and why people should be concerned about it. But there's also the aspect of talking about originally why something might have happened. And oftentimes looking at CVE descriptions, there'll be some confusion when doing root cause mapping about what language to identify to be able to understand what the root cause was. A lot of times people will look to things like impact and conflate that with the root cause. And that's where you can sometimes arrive at, I will call it bad mappings, but mappings that aren't necessarily as accurate as they should be. I think it's important to talk about the fact that CWE's weaknesses are organized around behaviors. So this is what a product does wrong that introduces the vulnerabilities downstream. So yeah, just to kind of go back over the kind of language that we're talking about, there's impact language, talking about what a vulnerability ends up impacting downstream, the actual attack, and then mitigation language. There's also prerequisite language, which could be discussing what things are needed to enable an attack. And we'll go into a theoretical example here. So in this description, an unauthenticated attacker could access sensitive data and execute specific commands and functions with full admin rights. And this goes on to say that this is due to authentication mechanism not working as intended. So if we were to dissect this in terms of the different language that we see, we have the unauthenticated attacker, which is a prerequisite to this vulnerability happening. Some people would conflate that with, that must mean that there's no authentication happening. And in the bad mappings, you'll see maybe someone will say, that must mean there's missing authentication. But if you look in the blue, what's actually happening here is that the authentication mechanism is not actually working as intended. So we would prefer a mapping such as weak authentication, or one of its children. If you can get even more specific, the more specific, the better. And then the technical impact there, which is about accessing sensitive data, executing commands. Those could also lead to some of these other bad mappings, such as command injection or exposure of sensitive information. And those mappings aren't necessarily the root cause of what's happening here. Those are the impacts that the root cause of the weak authentication led to. So just to kind of go over some more general, I know that was an access control example, but what kind of language qualifies for these types of things? So prerequisite examples like unauthorized user, unauthenticated remote attacker, admin user. Those things are not describing the actual weakness. And then technical impacts could be bypass authorization, authentication bypass, gaining privileges. These things are not the weakness that enables it, but the impact that happens afterwards. So discussing the mapping usage labels, this is an element of CWE, which we've introduced to try to help people doing mapping understand, is a mapping a good mapping or a bad mapping? And I'll hand it over to Steve to guide us through these slides.
Thanks, Connor. One thing that we've been doing in the past couple of years, and we've talked about it at VulnCon, is not every single CWE is appropriate to even consider for mapping. And every CWE entry we have, if it has an ID, it has a mapping usage label. And one of the key aspects of these mapping usage labels are whether a CWE might be appropriate for mapping a particular vulnerability to its root cause. We have cases where, a mapping to a particular CWE, we say, yep, this is allowed. This is a valid CWE to map to if the conditions are appropriate. In other cases, we might have little soft warnings like, yes, it's allowed, you can map to this one, but to you, the mapper, you should probably pay attention to a couple certain subtleties that we then try and spell out. Then we have CWEs that are discouraged. They're there, they exist, they're about weaknesses, but they might not always be appropriate to use. There are often better CWEs that would be available, and or they could be commonly misused. And I'm going to get into a couple examples in a moment. And then finally, there are CWEs that are prohibited from mapping. They simply should not be used. This is for things such as CWE categories, which are just arbitrary groupings of CWEs, or views. And you don't want to map to those kinds of IDs. And so we explicitly label those as prohibited. It used to be a few years ago that people would often map to prohibited CWEs, but we've noted some really significant improvements over the years. Why that improvement exists, I'm not entirely sure, but we don't have a lot of prohibited CWEs to get mapped to anymore these days. So thankful for that. Now, let's move on to the next slide here in the interest of time. So CWE 20, anyone who does CWE mapping for any period of time knows and perhaps dislikes CWE 20 as much as I do. Improper input validation, that's just like a common thing that happens. It's a very easy way to describe a lot of vulnerabilities. However, it's frequently misused. It frequently hides what the root cause is. Alternately, it's also really very high level, and it's very general abstraction. And for example, we've had for 3 or 4 years, I think now, maybe longer, we've had lower level CWEs that are about more specific kinds of input validation errors for the not correctly validating the type of the input that's coming in, or you're getting a quantity and you're not validating what the quantity is. And Art and Anion, I see what you're saying there. I love CWE 22. CWE 20 also. I actually do love CWE 22, which is path reversal. Getting distracted here. Anyway, this is one example of some of the mapping usage notes that we have for CWE 20. And these kinds of information layout and recommendations and explanations are associated with every single CWE ID. Let's talk a little bit more and go into the next slide and talk about some other CWEs that are often that are discouraged. And these are ones that have close associations with technical impact, for example. So we have one CWE 269, which is titled Improper Privilege Management, which is really about the product is not actually assigning privileges correctly, or it's not tracking them or changing them accordingly. And that's actually a relatively rare thing that happens. But people who are doing mapping often say, oh, they see privilege, okay, and the consequence, the technical impact of this vulnerability is being able to gain privileges or to do privilege escalation. But that's really a technical impact. That's not really related directly to the root cause of assigning incorrect privileges to a process. To give you an example here, suppose there's a buffer overflow in a set UID application that allows a regular user to become root if they exploit the overflow. The root cause really is in the mistake in how the buffer overflow occurred in the first place, not that the set UID application is running with excessive privileges. It probably often isn't. And so CWE 269 for improper privilege management is one commonly misused one because it's associated with technical impact a little bit too closely. And similarly, CWE 200, which is about exposing sensitive information to an unauthorized actor. CWE 200 and its extensive set of children really is about when the product explicitly and intentionally inserts sensitive information into resources or messages that are supposed to be made accessible to other people. You know, you might publish a particular data file and accidentally put in sensitive information into that data file, and that data file is intended to be accessible to everybody, but you just happen to be putting in the wrong sensitive information into it. But, you know, we're all familiar with information leaks, information disclosure, and so on. And so this CWE 200 is often used when someone is really talking about what the technical impact is of a particular vulnerability. In doing your root cause analysis thinking, the real questions are to ask is, you know, what weakness or what mistake caused the information to be leaked in the first place? Was it, say, insecure permissions? Maybe you weren't performing authentication in a particular case, which was then allowing people to access sensitive information. Things such as path traversal, where you can read files you aren't even supposed to, poor encryption, so on and so forth. So one would need to be careful for CWE 200 as well. This is just a couple examples here. We have a URL here, and we'll paste it into the chat, that really deals with, you know, problematic mapping CWEs, of which two of these I've just touched on a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. Allowed with review, these are, you know, CWEs that are valid to map to, at least sometimes, but we want the readers to really pay closer attention to it. And one of the most common offenders, so to speak, is CWE 77, which is about command injection. It's about command injection for any kind of command language. However, when people say command injection, often they mean something a little bit lower level, which is OS command injection. There are other languages besides shell languages that you're using to construct OS commands. There are other kinds of commands besides those associated with OSs, and yet people oftentimes map to CWE 77. So this is a case where, you know, we allow mapping to CWE 77, but we're saying, you know, the user should really review this. Maybe there's another CWE that would be a better mapping for them to use. And let's go ahead to the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. We did want to discuss, I know there's been some discussions previously in the meeting about AI and how AI can help in general with CVE, but we've been exploring how AI could potentially help with root cause mapping. And this is an activity that we've been doing for, you know, probably over the last year in the root cause mapping working group, is trying to develop an LLM tool to aid with root cause mapping. Some applications for this could be batch assigning CWE mappings to groups of CVEs, singular CVE analysis, or what we're exploring in the future is a CWE chatbot that you could kind of ask questions to. And I think the really important thing to think about in terms of training a model to do mapping is it's only as good as the data you provide it. So one of the hard challenges is how do we train this, because some of the mappings out in the wild for CVE records that we could potentially use to train on are not as accurate as we would like them to be. And then there's the issue of when you're trying to give it a CVE description to find a mapping for, the description needs to have enough information for a tool to find a mapping. So just some of the limitations that we're thinking as we move forward. I will say, give a shameless plug, if anyone's interested in helping to kind of test this and move it forward and help with our development, we have the CWE Root Cause Mapping Working Group. Meets every third Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. It's a monthly meeting. Even this is also just a great time to ask mapping questions to the group or to us. If you're interested, please reach out by emailing cwe@miter.org. We have other kinds of conversations around root cause mapping, but the focus right now is specifically on the LLM tool for root cause mapping. If you have other mapping questions, feel free to reach out directly to cwe@miter.org. I know we've had some CNAs say, well, we don't know what to do. Sometimes there's no good CWE to map to. We love these kinds of questions. You might be right. And if that's the case, that could lead to a new CWE in the future. We'd love to hear those kind of feedback. And then lastly, I'll leave it on the questions and comments slide. There was just kind of two prompts that came to mind for me in terms of feedback we might be wanting to hear. But, continue to put questions and comments in the chat. I'll read through the chat during the next meeting. But yeah, again, if you have other comments and questions, feel free to email cwe@miter.org. I'll try to look through the chat and answer questions during the next meeting.